Okay, so we're going to continue looking at our second prototype, and we'll probably start and make a third prototype today. As we're doing this, the things to focus on are how we're using CSS to position the things on the page, and also any miscellaneous other stuff that we do with CSS. Like we made the links look kind of like buttons last time. So let's look at what we have here. Here is our home page. Made these nice little rounded buttons that we did, and it looks like this. Let's spruce this up a little bit, and then we'll go on to the next prototype. Let's put a background image on this. So let's go and look for a background tile someplace nice. Oh, that's pretty obnoxious.
I found some good ones by saying pattern instead of tile or background.
Yeah, you're probably right. CSS Background Pattern. All right, here's some good ones. And ideally we would pick something that we thought was representative or at least worked with our theme. I'm being picky this morning. Oh, wow. No. We do not want any sort of animated background. Do we want sassy background patterns? I don't know why I'm being so picky. Oh my goodness. Let's go with this one. This one's a nice. And I'm going to copy where it comes from so I can paste that. So I'm going to pick in the body. Background. Bush.png. And I'll go on the home page and edit. All right. Now when we do this, absolutely nothing happens. What did I do wrong? URL there. Okay. Now when I do this, that actually doesn't look bad as it is. All right. One thing, because the colors are light enough that the black font on top of it sort of isn't hard to read. So, but what you could do is you could maybe help out a little bit by giving a background of white for our main sections. One thing that you note that I'm doing here is I'm not positioning every little thing on the page. I'm just positioning and applying CSS to the main sections. You can go crazy with CSS and really start putting and trying to control every little single thing on the page, and that can make it difficult. It's better just to sort of position the main things on the page and let other things fall into place. Okay, that looks better. All right. Now the other thing that we can do that sometimes can be nice is we can put transparency, so that we can sort of see the pattern underneath it, but yet we can still sort of read it as well. So I can say opacity 0.5. Opacity of 0.5 is half see-through. It would be like, well, I don't know. I was going to say those curtains where you can see the light through it. That actually would probably be a higher number. The higher number is more solid. So an opacity of 1 would mean it's completely solid. You can't see through it at all. And an opacity of 0 would mean it's like glass. You can see right through it. So I'm going to go in here and put in an opacity. We'll try 0.5 and see how that works. All right. I don't like that. So maybe we'll bump it up to 0.8. And if we do that, we'll just get a hint of the pattern underneath it. Okay. That's sort of better. You almost can't even see that it's partly transparent. It's pretty subtle. On the monitor, you can see it a little bit better than you probably can on the screen. Okay, let's do something with the fonts because we just took the default fonts here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a serif font for the headings, and I'm going to use a sans serif font for everything else. That is pretty typical. All right. Serif fonts are easier to identify the letters with the little things, but they become a little harder to read when the font is small. So the big headings will have with serif font, everything else will have sans serif font. There's a little more transparent. Okay, so let's go and look for some good font combinations. All right, and they have some examples. There's Helvetica and Garamond. There's Montserrat and Courier New. Now, I talked about one of the limitations that you have is that the font has to be on the machine that's using it. Is there any way to guarantee that it's on the machine? Well, yeah, you can force them to download the font. So let's look at an example where we can download a Google font and then use on a web page. So let's pick Spartan, and let's pick I'm going to pick a serif font. Let's pick Merriweather. All right. So now what that tells me is what I need to do to put these fonts downloaded on my page. So I can copy this line of code and put it in my page. In the head section. And then in the CSS, I can use them this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say body uses the font family Spartan and sans serif. And my H1s, I want to use the other font, the serif font. Merriweather. So now if we look at our page, it uses those two fonts. I really don't like the transparency on this, but I'm going to leave it in just to demonstrate how you do transparency. All right. Now, this would be one change that we'd have to put on all our pages, though, right? Because the change I made to download the font, I had to put in the HTML. So remember, the changes that you make to the HTML, you have to make in every HTML page, where the changes that you make to the CSS file, you only have to make to the one CSS file. So this is sort of violating what I said before of we want to make all the changes only to the CSS. Well, we found a case here where the change needs to be made to the HTML, which means we have to copy it now into each one of our pages, which I'm not going to do, but it would be easy enough to copy and paste it. So this is a way to sort of guarantee if you have a specific font in mind that you want to use, that, that the person will have it, that it will be downloaded. All right, questions about this? This is position absolute. And again, the thing with position absolute is you specify a top and a left. And that glues down that top and left position with respect to the upper corner of the page. And as I scroll and I push that upper section of the page up, the rest of the web page will scroll with it. Okay. We're going to look at another thing called position fixed. Now, what is the difference between position fixed and position absolute? With position fixed, the element doesn't scroll with the page. Notice with position absolute, the content scrolls. As I scroll, the page scrolls. For some things, though, it's nice to have them nailed down, where even if you scroll, it doesn't move. I'm thinking of the navigation. It'd be real nice to put the navigation so that the navigation is stuck here. And if I scroll up or scroll down, then the navigation is going to stay in the same place. So I can do that pretty easily, and I'm going to make a third prototype that does that. So what I'm going to do is, if I want everything in the sort of in the middle of the screen and the navigation on this side and staying there, I'm going to push everything over maybe to this position, 310 pixels. So I'll push everything over 310 pixels to the left, except for the navigation. So, let me save that. And now I have the navigation here. But if I scroll, the navigation moves. All right? Well, I can fix that by changing this from position absolute to position fixed. So let me go into CSS, and I'm going to say for the navigation, instead of position absolute, I'm going to say position fixed. All right? Initially it looks the same, but if I scroll, the navigation stays there, which is pretty nice. And in fact, I might want to put the navigation up here if I'm doing that. So I'm going to put the navigation in the top left corner. And now, no matter where I scroll on the page, the navigation is always there. And that's a nice feature, especially if you have longer pages and you want to keep the navigation. Now, you could do this with any number of things. I could keep the heading a position fixed. In other words, I could keep this header position fixed, so it stays still. So I could say, for the header, I could say position fixed. Well, guess what? That's because we have the transparency on. Let's get rid of those transparencies. Let's go back to the blocks just being solid, and we'll see how it works. Scrolls over top of it. Is there a way that we can make it stay on top? Yes, there is, but it's not really reliable. That way it's called the z-index. All right? Z-index comes from mathematics where, if you have a graph in mathematics, a two-dimensional graph, you have an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate, whereas the x is horizontal, the y is vertical. Well, if you imagine a line coming out of a flat screen or board, that's called the z-coordinate. And so you can stack things up that way. So let's look at CSS z-index and see if we can get this going. An element with a greater stack order is always in front of an element with a lower stack order. So, if I go in and I make the z-index of the header 10, that takes care of it, because that pushes this guy on in front of the other ones.
So by default it's 0?
By default it's 0, right. The z-index, I haven't worked with the z-index a lot, because the z-index, especially in the past, has been notoriously sort of fluky, whereas there's a lot of quirks with the way that it works. All right? For something simple like this, it's probably not much of a problem. But for other things, it could be a problem. All right? So, that's another thing that we can do is position fixed. Let's play around with this some more, all right, just to get a sense. Because what I really want to do is I want to make a bunch of pages that look really different, all right, using essentially the same HTML. All right, so we've violated that rule a little bit, right? Because we put in that link to the fonts, and we put in the link to the background image. But we're pretty much following the rule of only changing the CSS, and we're getting the pages looking very, very different. So let's spend a little bit of time playing around and perfecting this one. So let's go in here. Let's make the header have a width of only 500 and the footer have a width of 500.
That was the top, not the width.
Thank you. Okay, so that looks a little bit different. Let's do something different with the background. Let's find a different background image. Let's go and Google Ohio. Let's make the flag the background image of the page. Keep in mind this might not look real good. All right. I don't know. Doesn't look bad. Doesn't look the best, but doesn't look bad.
Set a transparency on it.
We could set the transparency of it, but then that would cause us problems here.
I think you can set just the background transparency. But you have to do it with, instead of just saying white, you have to define it as RGBA.
Okay. Yes, we can. So, in other words, and in fact, let's not do the, let's keep the transparency, let's keep it not transparent in the border, but let's do transparent of the nav and the other things. So RGBA is another way of doing it. We talked about RGB last time. RGBA is where you can specify a fourth parameter, which is the opacity. And it'll be a number from 0 to 255. So if we were to make this, let's try 200 to start. And before I forget, background image from Wikimedia. So now if we look, okay. Oh, I set the background. I didn't set.
Actually,
I did set the opacity.
I think for RGBA, even though it is the 255 for the colors, it's still the regular opacity 1 to.
Oh, it's still 100. Okay.
For some reason.
All right, makes sense. I actually programmed in a language called processing that still uses the 0 to 255 for that, but that makes sense. All right,
Like it is with the regular opacity.
let's try that then.
Weird mixing of schemes.
Right. There we go. So we can see it poking underneath that. Now, one thing I don't like is it kind of makes the flag look weird because the flag is actually tiled, right? You know what I mean by tiled. It has a second copy of the image underneath it. Well, we can make the background image have no repeat by saying in the body, background repeat, colon, no repeat. So we'll only have one flag then. And if it scrolls too far, it'll just be a plain white background. Now, one thing that maybe you noticed when we pulled up this image is when I viewed the image before, it looked like it had a black background. Here it looks like it has a white background. The image is actually transparent. And how do we know that? Well, if we bring this up in a photo editor, GIMP is a photo editor that is very powerful. It is, in many ways, close to the equivalent of Photoshop, and it's absolutely free. So it's something that I recommend students try out if they want a good photo editor without spending a lot of money. If we look at that, notice how that there's a checkerboard there. That means that that's a transparent. So the background will be the color, whatever the background is. Whatever the rest of the background is, we'll see the flag on top of that color of background because it's transparent. Only certain file types can be transparent images. Only GIFs and PNGs can be transparent. JPEGs cannot be transparent. No transparent background. So, in other words, if I did this, background red URL flag, it's going to look like that. Whereas the red is going to be peeking through. I'm not sure I like that. Let's make it a background of gray. Oh, that's not so bad. That shows that you can have a background color as well as a background image. Now, might as well, yeah, question.
Could you also set it position fixed and then the movable portions when you scroll?
Good question. Let's see what the background position is on a background image. There's a background position, and let's see what the properties are. You can set it to left top, left center, left bottom, right top, right center, right bottom, and so on. You can use percentages, pixels. Yeah, I say it looks like it's calling it attachment. Let's look that up. Background image, it won't scroll. Background attachment fixed. The background image does not scroll now. All right, here's the thing about CSS. You gotta believe. I'm going to sound like either a preacher or a politician here, right? You gotta believe You got to believe that CSS offers a way to do most anything that you can fairly reasonable think of. Or at the very least, offers a way to do something that you've seen on other pages, right? But there's no possible way that you could have the entire CSS rulebook memorized. So, what do? You get good at Googling, right? So in that case, I honestly didn't know what the property was. If I've ever used this before, I don't remember it. But I knew it had something to do with the background image. So you do Google CSS background image and look until you see something that, yeah, that looks like it could be what I'm looking for, and then give it a shot. All right? So sometimes students get intimidated because we go over a lot of stuff in class, and there's even more stuff that we don't go over in class. All right? No one expects you to have all of this memorized. Now, for the things that you do all the time, yeah, you should probably know those off the top of your head, right? The kinds of things that you do all the time in CSS. How to change the background color. How to set the font family. All those things that you do every page, you should have a good idea of how to do it. But the things that you don't do so often, yeah, okay, if you have to look them up, no big deal. Okay? All right, let's play around a little more with this, and let's change the fonts a little bit. Let's do something different with the fonts. So let's look to see if there's a cool Google font that we can download. We're going to, again, my job is to make it different here. My job is not to make it look good. So we're going to pick this font. Yes?
Fonts. I remember reading something in the book about, because of the default fonts that are loaded between Windows and Mac OSs, if you put just font family and then sans serif,
You get the generic.
You'll automatically get, on the Macs you'll get the Helvetica,
Right.
but on Windows you'll get the Arial.
That's correct. That's the last font. Usually what you do is you specify a list of fonts, and you'll say Arial, Helvetica, sans serif. So if it has Arial, it will use that. If it has Helvetica, it will use that. If it has neither of those, it will use the generic sans serif. So let's pick Trade Winds and Bitter. Okay? Something didn't work with that. Oh, I forgot to save all the files. There we go. There we go. Oh, that's so ugly. But, hey, we're making it different. Our job is to make it different, not make it look good. All right? Your job will be to make it look different and good. All right. We can do even more with this. I can change the alignment. So I can make this X1, or H1 rather, have a text align of right. And maybe make the font size 1EM. All right. Maybe I can make the paragraph header, the header in the paragraph, or the paragraph in the header, have a real small font, the fine print. All right. Yeah. Okay. So let's look and see. We now have 3 prototypes. All right. We now have 3 prototypes. And they all look pretty different. Let's go through them. There's our first prototype that we developed. There's the second. And there's number 3. Now, we spent a fair amount of time on the first prototype, right? Each prototype we've done since then, we've done in a fraction of the time. Which means that if you were doing a website for a client, you could easily make a couple of prototypes and show the client that and get feedback from the client about what they like and what they don't like for it. So if we were doing this for the Ohio Tourist Bureau or something, they might look and say, "Hey, this was a little plain. I don't really like that. This one, I like the fonts, but I don't like the faded look of it. And the background really doesn't have anything to do with Ohio. But I like the way it's laid out." Then they'll see this and say, I like this background. I hate these fonts. Maybe we can go and take the background from this page and put it on this page and see how it goes, right? And in that way, you could easily take and combine the different prototypes together to make something that combines the best aspects of all of them, all right? It's very difficult for anyone to, when you give them a blank sheet of paper and say, go ahead and make what you want, design what you want, all right? It's very difficult for people to do that. If you went to a client and asked them, draw your perfect web page, many of them would be stuck and not know what to do. However, and this is a human nature thing, everyone could look at something and criticize it, right? I mean, it sounds bad, but that's true. You could look at it and say, I like this part of it, I don't like that part of it. Your job as a web designer is to get to the right answer, to come up with a good design that your client's going to like and is going to be usable and is going to be effective. You have to have a little bit of a thick skin when you do that, because you may be putting out there designs that the person is going to criticize and tell you you don't like it. Sometimes you put things out there on purpose just to get and test out and find out what the person's interested in. For example, this layout here is really, really, really simple and straightforward. I wouldn't expect any client to go for that. But, again, you can show them and they can make comments. Well, maybe I like this, but maybe if you put a background image behind that, that would be a little more interesting instead of just a plain white background. Even if you used a different color, or maybe these reds and blues are too bright. Maybe if they were a more subdued red, more of a scarlet, and more of a darker blue, or whatever. Okay, so there's 3 or 4 more techniques that we're going to explore. One of them is called relative position. All right? And one is called floating. One is called grids. And one is called flexbox. All right? So these are all techniques that we can do, and we'll cover those next week. Now, the one thing that I don't want you to lose track of is the whole notion of we have a certain amount of content that we make look a lot different through styling it. So we have 3 versions of the same page that look really different. Now, that will be useful when we start talking about designing for mobile devices. Because on a mobile device, we want to show the same web page on a computer as we show on the phone. All right? But we want it to look different. Typically, you want a simple layout on the phone. And you can have a more involved, intricate layout on a computer. So maybe this is a real nice layout for a computer. But if we were to view this on a phone, which you can simulate in Google Chrome by going here and saying, well, what would this look like on an iPhone? Well, that's going to be kind of hard to read on an iPhone. All right? But this one, if we were to look and see how it would look like on an iPhone, probably doesn't look so bad. So we might want to do something where on a computer we have this kind of layout. On a mobile device we have a simpler layout for our web page. So that whole notion of having the same HTML and applying different CSS files to it, we're going to use that idea when we get into designing for mobile stuff. We just need a way of telling the browser, use this CSS file if you're a computer, use this CSS file if you're a mobile device. That's the missing ingredient. And it's actually not that hard to do. So we'll talk about that probably sometime next week. All right. That's all I had for today. We'll see you in lab.